Hi all, it's Dr. White. I'm here with the promised video. I decided to go ahead and do an extra video. I know I talked about this some in our class meeting, but I wanted to do an extra video on boundaries and competence just so you'd have a little bit additional information on that since some students were requesting it. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so I apologize for my voice, and I am going to just be kind of referring to notes because whatever's going on with my sinus issue, it's causing some lapse of memory. So please just bear with me. So just to kind of highlight to make sure we're all on the same page regarding competence, as I talked about in our class meeting, competence usually is measured by a couple different things. And this is covered in Area C of the ACA Code of Ethics. So something to think about when you're thinking about competence, you're going to think about education, supervision, and experience. Some other things that typically notate competence in an area is licensure, certification, etc. Now that doesn't always equal competence, and there's like a general overall competence. So I might have a general overall competence of I know how to treat major depressive disorder, or I know how to treat some, basic DSM disorders. And maybe I've worked with adults for 15 years. And I might not feel really competent working with children because that's not an area that I have a ton of experience in. Yes, I have a degree. Yes, I have certifications. Yes, I have overarching knowledge. Sorry. But lacking some of that experience. So I might need some additional consultation or some supervision in that area. So that's one example of how competence isn't as easy, cut and dry as you might think. Now, there's also, your book talked about competence and how do we assess that. So like I said, there's some external things that we do to assess with licensure, etc. And there's certain licensing tests. I know as a counselor in most states, you have to take at least 2, 3, sometimes up to 4 different types of exams, whether that's the National Counselor's Exam. Most states have a state law exam, like the counseling laws, and then some have different levels of licensure. So whether you have a supervision credential, you're independently licensed, dependently licensed, etc. So I know that's a lot of detail for you all at this point, and some of that will come to fruition for people who want to go on for their master's degree, but it is something to think about, and not anybody can just go in and say, hey, I'm a counselor, because you do have to be competent in the area. And with that competence, the assessment, you could also have internal assessment. So that's when I was talking about, like, I might not feel competent in this particular area, or maybe there's a disorder that I'm not particularly competent with. Like, say I've never diagnosed anyone with Tourette's disorder. Well, then I would seek consultation or supervision in working with that particular client. There's also some other things that are coming up as far as competence goes, specifically related to COVID. So are you competent using technology? What kind of technology? And I always feel like as soon as I am competent in a technology, it's outdated and we have a new technology for me to learn. So that's something as well. When we're not competent in a particular issue, say it is end of life issues, and that's not an issue I work with, and I know somebody in my town who specializes in that area, then I would refer that client out to get services maybe from somebody else, because they can provide better services. Now, you can't just refer out because it's based on your belief system. Like, oh, well, I don't really want to work with immigrants, so I'm just going to refer them. That's based, or that could be based on your bias, and bias is not a reason to refer. It doesn't necessarily have to do with your related to your competence. So, which is kind of a sticky issue. And in some states, they actually do allow you to refer based on strongly held beliefs. Most states don't, and the ACA definitely recommends against it. So that's something to think about. Continuing education, which kind of goes hand in hand with the consultation and the supervision. So even after you're done with all of your education, you still have supervision, you still have the opportunity for consultation, and always to have additional education. I feel like the more I know what I don't know. And I mean, this kind of rings true for me this week because I am renewing licensure. So I'm licensed as a counselor in Ohio, and we have to have 30 continuing education credits every 2 years. So, and that can be on any topic. 3 of it does have to be on ethics. Certain states require certain things. So some states require CEs in suicide prevention. Some states require it in other topics. If you're a supervisor, and you have a supervisor credential, then you may have additional training that you have to get in supervision as well. So that continuing education, as long as you're licensed, you're going to be required to gain this CEs or CEUs, continuing education units, outside of your normal position or your job, and then report that to your state board every 2 years. So also with competence, you have to have a death plan. So what happens if I die? Like, what happens if I'm in private practice? What happens to all my clients' records? Who do those clients go to? So part of your competence is having a plan. What if something happens to me? What if there's injury, something like that? Having a backup plan for those clients. So that's just kind of an overall view. A lot of the competence information is discussed in section C, but I think you can see it kind of sprinkled throughout. I mean, I think that there's some competence and boundary stuff in like how you're promoting yourself and those sorts of things, which are in other sections as well. So the next chapter was on boundaries. Boundaries is such a huge issue. There could be an entire class just on this particular topic. And as I said in our class meeting, I was the ethics chair for the Tennessee Licensed Professional Counseling Association for many years, and most of the calls that I did receive for consultation were regarding boundaries and boundary issues. And this is the primary reason that counselors lose their license. So there's like the obvious, don't have sex with your clients, but then there's other things like maybe you're using a book in a class, and so I'm promoting and making my students buy that book. Well, is that a boundary issue? Maybe there's the issue of I see a client walking to session, it's pouring down rain, they're getting wet. I'm also going to session. Do I give that client a ride? Well, would I give every client a ride? What happens if we get in a car wreck on the way? What happens if they think that I am hitting on them? Like, there's all kind of extra things that could happen. But you can see how the intent just to help somebody get out of the rain might not be like a huge boundary crossing, but how it is intended versus how it is received. Sorry, allergies, sinus, can be very different. So we want to obviously avoid harm. So that talks about boundaries because that's part of boundaries, and even putting our own cultural beliefs on somebody is a boundary violation, which a lot of you talked about in your case studies. And that's in section A4. And then there's also the non-professional counseling roles. So what if I go to church with somebody who is my client? Well, I've been at that church for 15 years. I start seeing this client, etc. Now I recognize this client at church. Like, am I required to change churches that I've been at for 15 years based on this client? No, not necessarily. And you're going to have a lot of what we call, and there's a difference, well, some of the literature says there's a difference between like a boundary slip, a boundary violation, a boundary crossing, etc. So it's kind of like that gray area. Like, obviously, you're definitely crossing a boundary if you're sleeping with a client, but maybe if you're in a small town and the only place to fix a lawnmower is this client's shop, so you have to take your lawnmower to this shop, and kind of what does that look like for you? Do they feel like that they owe it to you, or do you feel like, there's all of that. Like, do you feel like you have to take it there because it's your client? Should you go out of town? I mean, there's all of those different things. And part of it is just documenting that. So if you are going to extend boundaries, how are you going to document that? And that is in section because we realize that not everybody's going to have really rigid boundaries. Sometimes you'll have a school-based counselor attending graduation. Well, maybe I wouldn't necessarily attend graduation. I've had clients with many boundary violations, but I've had clients invite me to their wedding. My partner's had clients, children invite him to a funeral of a client that he had had. I've had clients contact me on MySpace. I know, I'm old. I've had clients contact me on Facebook, like direct message me. And is that a boundary violation? How do you respond? How do you document that, etc.? Like, I didn't respond. My clients know up front that they're not allowed to contact me on social media, and I will not respond no matter what they say. But then there is that situation is, what if they contact you and they say, hey, I'm suicidal, but they're saying it on social media? Like, are you really not going to react to that? So there's all of that. And then also living in Tennessee, Kentucky, we have a lot of very rural communities to where we might have multiple interactions with our clients. So maybe it's somebody we went to high school and we're seeing their kid or their grandkid. Maybe we know the family name just because it's the police officer, or, there's all of these overlapping things, which are like extending those boundaries, but making sure that we're discussing those boundaries with the client and that we are documenting if we do have to have some boundary blurring. So those are the, I guess, main things I kind of wanted to touch on. I know I did some of that in the class meeting, but I just kind of wanted to focus in solely on that so that I could upload this video for anybody who wanted kind of the shorter abridged version of the highlights from those 2 chapters. Okay, thanks. Bye.